Flash Bulletin. We break into regular programming with an urgent report from the shadow of the British throne. A silent, merciless power shift has just been executed behind the soundproofed walls of Buckingham Palace. An absolute institutional purge that permanently rewrites the bloodline of the world's most formidable monarchy. What was once whispered in private corridors as a family fracture has ignited into a cold, constitutional execution. An irreversible royal decree, drawn up in total secrecy, has effectively severed the House of Windsor from its rogue offspring, stripping away titles, power, and protection in a single, devastating blow. This is not merely a legal dispute. It is the total, calculated annihilation of a royal legacy, deliberate and terrifying in its absolute finality. Inside a heavily guarded, sealed chamber within Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick with the weight of centuries. Outside, the London sky hung heavy and gray, but inside, time itself seemed to freeze. Rain pattered against the tall window panes, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. At the center waited a single black leather portfolio, stamped with the blinding gold royal cipher, the mark confirming that whatever lay within carried the absolute authority of the sovereign. Two senior legal officers stood motionless beside the table like shadows, holding crisp parchment documents that contained the death warrant of a prince's formal existence. There were no advisors and no soft words of consolation, only the cold mechanics of the state. King Charles III stepped forward, his face etched with deep lines of exhaustion and grim resolve. The decree before him was uncompromising and brutal. It stated in precise, cold legalese that Meghan Markle's title as Duchess of Sussex was hereby permanently revoked. Her remaining patronages were extinguished, her royal privileges severed, and both she and Prince Harry were explicitly banned from ever representing the crown again. Crucially, a final directive was woven into the text. Their household was cast into exile, systematically excluded from all future state ceremonies and official royal gatherings. There was no clause for mercy, no pathway for appeal, and no route back. The king reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the heavy fountain pen. For one agonizing second, the monarch vanished, and only a heartbroken father remained. A sudden, haunting memory flashed through his mind, a distant image of Harry as a young boy running across the lawns of Balmoral, innocent and untamed, long before the world tore him away. The heavy silence in the room pressed down upon Charles's chest like an iron weight. But the monarchy is a demanding master that consumes personal love to feed institutional survival. Duty, ironclad and unforgiving, pulled him back. Charles leaned down and pressed a nib to the thick parchment. The pen touched the paper for only a few seconds, but those seconds destroyed years of royal ambiguity and shattered a family beyond repair. Wet black ink soaked into the decree, formalizing the destruction of his younger son's standing. When his signature was complete, Charles dropped the pen onto the polished wood with a dull click. No one spoke. The silence was broken only by the sharp rustle of paper as one officer lifted the decree, while the second prepared the hot crimson wax. As the brass royal seal was brought down to crush the red wax, King Charles abruptly turned his back. Stepping toward the window, he stared out into the courtyard, refusing to watch the mark of banishment being pressed into place. Thousands of miles away, inside the quiet sanctuary of Montecito, California, the digital transmission arrived like a thunderclap. Meghan stood beside the marble island, holding her phone with white-knuckled intensity as she read the opening paragraph twice. Her face, usually so expressive, hardened in an instant before completely emptying of color. The full, catastrophic reality of the palace's strike hit her like a physical blow. She slowly turned her head toward Harry, her eyes searching his face with intense, razor-sharp scrutiny. She asked him softly, her voice dangerously quiet, if he had known this was coming. Harry stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the floor as an unbearable silence enveloped the room. He denied it, but his hesitation was too long, his silence far too deep. Suspicion, dark and poisonous, bloomed immediately between them. As Harry took the tablet from her hand and scrolled deeper into the hidden pages, he uncovered the true sting of his father's judgment. A hidden clause strictly forbidding the Sussexes from using their names, titles, or status in commercial projects suggesting royal authority. It was a strike directed straight at the core of their identity, a final judgment proving the monarchy had permanently closed every route back. William watched from the quiet shadow of the stateroom as King Charles closed the primary folder, but his sharp eyes immediately locked onto what lay beneath it, a second, smaller, sealed document. The king's hand lingered over the dark leather binding for a fraction of a second, a subtle hesitation that did not escape the future monarch. In that single, unsaid moment, William understood that the public decree was merely the visible strike. Beneath the formal punishment rested a hidden, far more lethal mechanism, a secret clause designed to systematically neutralize any lingering influence the Sussexes held. The public wound had been dealt, but the deeper, unseen hemorrhage had only just begun. Behind the grand titles, legalistic decrees, and gilded architecture, 4 lives were now irrevocably trapped within 4 distinct visions of betrayal. For King Charles, the act was an agonizing sacrifice of fatherhood, a sovereign forcing his broken heart into submission to shield the crown from institutional collapse. For Prince William, it was an imperative act of grand strategy, protecting the stability of the throne he would one day inherit. For Harry, it was a knife through the spine, a brutal confirmation that his father had ultimately chosen the cold tyranny of the monarchy over the blood of his youngest son. And for Meghan, it was the final, calculated rejection she had always anticipated from an unyielding palace establishment. Yet none of them truly comprehended that this decree would not merely enforce a constitutional divide, but expose a festering dynastic wound that had never been allowed to heal. For Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex title had never been a simple decorative honor. It was a geopolitical lever, a shield, and an irreplaceable bridge to a world of global authority she refused to let the palace strip from her grasp. Losing it felt like surrendering the power to control her own narrative. Harry's agony was far more existential. He was a prince bred in the marrow of the very institution he had dared to defy, still bound by desperate filial love. Defending his wife meant accepting a devastating truth, that his place within his ancestral home was extinguished forever. In the quiet hour preceding a private strategic briefing at Clarence House, King Charles sat alone in the dim light of his study. In his trembling hands, he held an old, silver-framed photograph of Harry as a 7-year-old boy, laughing brightly on the estate grounds. The king studied the child's face for several agonizing seconds, his breathing heavy with unspoken regret. But as footsteps echoed down the stone hallway, Charles quickly placed the photograph face down on the desk, just as William entered the room. That swift, guilty motion exposed the agonizing tear inside the king's soul, a father hiding his sorrow from the uncompromising heir who demanded absolute resolve. William noticed the inverted frame immediately, but his face remained a mask of iron discipline. Stepping to the desk, the Prince of Wales opened a confidential briefing document, systematically explaining why every soft alternative had been rejected. Every previous temporary settlement, William argued, had only cultivated fresh hostility. One agreement degenerated into legal battles over global branding. Another reopened bitter disputes regarding ceremonial representation. A third raised critical security and authority concerns over who truly spoke for the crown. The future king no longer viewed compromise as a path to peace. He viewed it as a lethal delay that invited continuous blackmail. In California, the atmosphere within the Montecito estate turned icy. During a tense video conference call with their legal advisors, Meghan violently pushed the printed decree across the desk, while Harry picked it up, staring at his father's sweeping signature in stunned disbelief. She demanded to know whether his quiet passivity during recent palace negotiations had allowed this catastrophe to unfold. Harry opened his mouth to reply, but his voice failed him. That suffocating silence became a far deeper injury than the document itself, planting a dark seed of doubt in Meghan's mind as to whether her husband had ever possessed the strength to shield her. Even within the highest palace walls, dissenting warnings echoed. Queen Camilla had confronted Charles during a recorded private conversation preserved within the confidential household accounts. warning him that stripping Meghan's rank might preserve the legal frame of the crown, while permanently destroying any last hope of saving Harry. Charles listened in motionless silence, his jaw set tightly, yet he refused to reverse course. To understand why the king ultimately embraced such absolute destruction, one must return to the fateful Windsor gathering that changed everything. A closed-door confrontation months earlier, where the illusion of family reconciliation dissolved into total institutional war. The catastrophic Windsor confrontation, months before the signature fell, remained the true catalyst of the monarchy's decisive purge. King Charles had convened the emergency council in total isolation, stripping the drawing room of press officers, royal aides, and official scribes. Only 4 figures sat around the ancient oak table: the king, the Prince of Wales, Prince Harry, and Meghan. Charles sought to quietly resolve 3 existential questions that threatened to tear the crown apart. Whether the Sussexes would attend future royal ceremonies, how their children would remain connected to the sovereign bloodline, and whether royal titles could be monetized while building an independent enterprise abroad. Harry had arrived clinging to fragile hope, but that hope disintegrated the moment his brother spoke. William's voice was as cold as iron. Freedom, the heir asserted with absolute finality, could never include royal power without royal responsibility. The temperature in the room plummeted as Charles laid a binding confidentiality undertaking before Meghan. The parchment was a written promise that all future private correspondence and family exchanges would remain locked in eternal secrecy. Meghan read the document slowly, her dark eyes glittering with controlled defiance, before asking why genuine family reconciliation required mandatory silence. The king answered softly that trust could never survive when every private word risked becoming public material. In response, Meghan placed an unsigned commercial partnership proposal on the table. Beside the Sussex title, a highlighted line described the couple as possessing an independent, global royal platform. William leaned across the table, his finger pointing directly at those words, demanding their immediate and permanent removal. He stated that the phrase falsely suggested authority the couple no longer held. Meghan refused to yield, declaring with icy conviction that the palace did not own their identity. Sensing the room tightening around them, Harry issued a desperate threat. If restrictions continued, they would release archived correspondence showing how the palace had treated them during their departure. The king ended the meeting at once. Meghan stood, pushed her chair back, and walked toward the door, leaving the unsigned confidentiality paper untouched. Harry remained seated for 3 agonizing, silent seconds, staring at his father before following her into the hall. As the heavy Windsor door thundered closed, William retrieved the abandoned proposal and placed it directly before the monarch. "This will never stop," William said, his voice ringing with terrifying clarity, "until the crown makes it stop." That closed door did not end the argument. It carried it forward to the final showdown at Clarence House 2 nights before the signing. Desperate to halt the decree, Harry had demanded direct access to his father, and Charles had agreed to meet him in a private sitting room. But the king refused one absolute condition before the discussion began. Meghan would not join by video link. The conversation had to remain strictly between father and son, free from competing loyalties. When Harry sat forward, his grief instantly exploded into accusation. He accused Charles of humiliating his wife merely to satisfy William and palace officials who had never accepted her independence. He warned that removing her title would prove the monarchy had always viewed her as disposable. Charles did not raise his voice. The king answered quietly that Harry had repeatedly carried private family conflicts into public life, making it impossible to separate reconciliation from relentless negotiation. Every gesture of trust became material that might later be exposed. The crown, Charles stated, could not survive if private access was continually weaponized as public pressure. Harry struck the arm of his chair with an open palm, the sound echoic and sharp. He demanded that his father look at him as a son rather than a problem. Charles raised his eyes and quietly replied, "I am looking at both." The anger vanished from Harry's face, replaced by a hollow, crushing hurt. The king's answer confirmed the ultimate nightmare. His father still loved him, but genuinely believed he had become a mortal danger to the institution. In a desperate final gesture, Harry offered a surrender. He and Meghan would stop using the HRH styling commercially, provided they retained the Sussex title and received invitations to major family ceremonies. The proposal sounded like total concession, yet Charles remained impassive. The king revealed that the decree had already passed full constitutional and legal approval. Royal advisors had confirmed it operated flawlessly within the Crown's authority. Only his signature remained. Their meeting could change their personal bond, Charles said, but not the decision itself. Harry rose slowly, convinced William had engineered his downfall. But before he reached the door, Charles stopped him, revealing that the strongest recommendation for the decree had come from someone Harry had never once suspected. The hidden voice behind the sovereign's stroke had not been William's alone, but that of Princess Anne. It was the Princess Royal who had delivered the definitive assessment, analyzing years of failed compromises, disputed commercial ventures, and fractured protocols with cold, analytical precision. During a quiet, high-stakes meeting at St. James's Palace, Anne laid a comprehensive review file before her brother, demonstrating that every temporary accommodation had merely cultivated fresh constitutional vulnerability. She argued that titles must represent continuing duty, not inherited entitlement without institutional responsibility. When King Charles asked with a heavy heart if there truly was no alternative path, Anne held his gaze and delivered the decisive verdict. There had been other ways, but they had all been exhausted and refused. Her brutal clarity stripped away the monarch's last reservations, proving that duty demanded absolute surgical finality. Once the monarch's seal was pressed, the decree moved swiftly from confidential chambers into immediate, systemic execution. Within hours, the administrative machinery of the royal household purged the Sussex name from official state rolls, diplomatic registries, and palace rosters. Ceremonial planning departments received strict orders. Prince Harry and Meghan were permanently removed from all royal event agendas, their patronages stripped, and their remaining household support disbanded. While private family contact legally remained untouched, formal access to the sovereign was severed. Any future entrance into royal estates would now require explicit, case-by-case authorization, a devastating shift from an inherited prince to a monitored guest. The machinery of state operated with terrifying efficiency, erasing an entire era of royal history in a single afternoon. In Montecito, as news of the administrative purge broke, Meghan watched the palace website update in real time, her former title erased from official registries. The digital deletion felt total, as though years of struggle, duty, and survival had been extinguished with a single keystroke. Turning to Harry, she declared that the institution had systematically erased her. But Harry, staring out into the Pacific dusk, replied softly that they had not erased the woman, but the role, a distinction that exposed the deep, painful divide between their perceptions. Though advisors presented them with a fiery, combative legal challenge to dispute the commercial restrictions, Harry urged restraint. He admitted that fighting a public war was merely an attempt to avoid grieving the family life he had lost. Moved by his vulnerability, Meghan tore their prepared attack statement down the middle, choosing to release a quiet, dignified declaration instead. They would not contest the decree. Their future would now stand completely detached from the crown. By sunrise, the decree had ignited a fierce global storm. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered under grey London skies, arguing bitterly over the monarch's decision. Broadcasters replayed the breaking bulletin endlessly, while front pages across the nation splashed the image of Charles's signature under dark, ominous headlines. To traditionalists, the king had heroically defended the sacred integrity of the crown. To critics, he had executed a ruthless institutional punishment against his own kin. Yet inside Kensington Palace, William watched the television coverage with a grim, heavy heart. He had achieved the structural order necessary to secure his future reign, but as commentators framed the outcome as a bitter, brotherly victory, he realized the unbearable cost. He had permanently lost the brother who was meant to stand beside him in the long years ahead. In the quiet solitude of his private study, King Charles composed a final letter to his younger son, a page free of royal seals, legal jargon, or sovereign titles. Written simply from a father to his child, the letter affirmed that while the crown's constitutional judgment was immutable, the door to a private, personal relationship would remain open. He sealed the envelope and wrote only Harry across the front. When the letter arrived in California, Harry did not burn or destroy it. Instead, he placed it carefully inside a drawer beside old childhood photographs. Days later, taking up a blank piece of paper, he penned a simple, two-word reply. Dear Pa. The decree had achieved its cold purpose, preserving the monarchy's boundaries at the price of an unhealable domestic tragedy. The throne moved forward into history, immutably fortified, yet shadowed forever by the human sacrifice required to sustain its absolute power. If you found this deep dive into the shadows of royal intrigue compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more breaking analyses of historic power shifts.